Welcome to the Learning Cosmos podcast. I'm your host, André Hedlund, educational psychologist, author, geek, and nerd. This show brings you science and learning through conversations with stellar people from different fields. Put on your spacesuits and hold tight. Our voyage into the learner's universe begins now. All right, so welcome to another episode of the Learning Cosmos podcast. And thank you so much for being my guest today, Joseph Devlin. I can call you Joe, right? You prefer
Please
Joe?
do. That'd be great.
So how's it going, Joe? Thank you so much for saying yes to this podcast.
I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for the invitation, and everything's going well.
Wow, wonderful. You just told me you are in very close to Heathrow, right? So you're based in
I
England.
am.
Yeah.
So you may actually even see airplanes landing above me in the window. But yes, I live very close.
Great, great. So let me start with I think, the most thought-provoking question, because I always ask my guests, what is the importance? Why does science matter, especially nowadays? Because I feel like people are attacking science, they're denying science. So why is science important, Joe?
Well, I think, as a kid, my answer to that would be because I was always a curious kid who wanted to know why. You know how when you have like 3-year-olds, that's what they do, right? They always say, why? Why,
Yeah.
mom? Why, dad? I'm not sure I ever outgrew that. And
Yeah.
so at a personal level, I find the sort of stories behind why things occur really fascinating, and not just in my field, in lots of different areas. But you're right. I think that we've moved into an almost post-truth era where why isn't always so important. And I think that in many cases, maybe that doesn't matter, but there are probably lots of cases where it does, right? So, we just lived through the pandemic where we had loads of people questioning the science behind the pandemic. But the reality is that compared to something like the Spanish influenza that killed, nearly a third of the world's population in the, 1910s, this one was bad, but it didn't do that.
Yeah.
And I think the main reason is because of science.
That's
Um,
so true. Yeah. And
So, I think these things are important, but I recognize that's also a personal bias of mine.
and we will talk a lot about biases today. I'm very interested in biases, but I think you're right. I think a lot of people don't understand science, and then because of that, they tend to promote ideas that are not really right about how the world works. And that's kind of scary. I think. Do you ever think about that, Joe? That the way things are going today, that there's so many people with power and not so much power spreading fake news about everything. Do you get worried at all, or that doesn't really cross your mind nowadays?
I definitely worry about it, but I
Yeah.
also think that it's kind of intrinsic to just being human. I think that as people, we are storytellers.
Yeah.
And one of the problems with science is it's normally pretty complicated, right? Um, it's, when you think about something really that we all take for granted, like gravity, and Newton's whole thing about apples falling from trees. Well, how come they always fall down, right? It's a pretty simple question, and we've
Yeah.
all seen it. But his answer was pretty complicated, and that is nothing compared to what Einstein came up with to answer that question.
That's true.
So when it comes to trying to tell the stories that give us a way to navigate our daily life, we often try to simplify. The problem is when we oversimplify, and that leads to decisions that aren't the best decisions in our interest, right?
Yeah. And I think, before we talk a little bit about your field in particular, I think you kind of touched on something I wanted to ask you. What is the meaning of neurobolics? Because, that's what people, when we oversimplify things, I think we tend to create neurobolics, right? Am I right?
Yeah, this is my particular interest is in the brain and in neuroscience. And there's so much neuromyth and neuro nonsense out there that at one point I'm American and I live in England. So the first time I heard a British person say something was bollocks, I thought it was hysterical. I think they
Yeah.
were serious, but I thought it was funny. So a few years later, when I heard people talking about neurobolics, that just resonated with me so much because I thought,
Yeah.
oh, right, that captures all of the nonsense from just misunderstandings to the kind of myths that we share to some of the more intentional misinformation that gets shared, right? And
Yeah.
some of that, I think, borders on fraudulent as companies monetize, consumers' lack of knowledge about the brain. And if that's done intentionally, that's neurobolics.
Okay. And so you know a lot of different types of neurobolics. Can you give us one example?
Sure. Well, one of the ones that everybody gets all the time is the idea that we only use 10% of our brains.
Oh yeah.
So you see this in popular culture. It's in movies like Limitless or Lucy,
Oh
where they take a
yeah.
drug, right? And it opens up their brain and they get superpowers, which is cool. It makes for really undeniably fun, entertainment. But you also see it play out in like coaching and education and things where
Yeah.
people are making decisions on information that's not correct. And it's a funny one because we don't use 10% of our brain, we use 100% of our brain, and we use
Yeah.
it all the time. But that doesn't mean that we're at capacity, right? There's no evidence that in the course of your lifetime you'll ever get full up. You can always keep
Exactly.
learning. And that's actually where the myth came from. It was a misconstrual of something that was said in a book in 1910 about never being able to fill up your mental capacity. And then it got put at the beginning of Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People in a
Yep.
forward. And it was described as, well, we only use 10% of our brain. So if you're going to improve yourself, read this book and you're going to unlock some of that extra material. The truth of the matter is, um, if you're searching for drugs or ways of doing that, that can be really harmful.
Yeah.
There are safe and not safe ways of enhancing your perception, using chemicals. Um, and if that's your focus, if you want to, unlock your brain and see the world in a different way, then, possibly taking ayahuasca will be okay, and possibly not.
Yeah. Exactly. And it's funny because I remember Lucy, watching Lucy, and I remember that I think it was Morgan Freeman who played the neuroscientist who had discovered something very important, that Lucy needed him for something. And there's a scene he's actually lecturing a bunch of students, and somebody goes like, "Okay, what happens if we unlock, like, 20% of our brain or whatever?" And it all sounds and looks very serious for the layperson. Like, so if you don't have any background in neuroscience or cognitive psychology, you have no idea if that's true or not, right? So now I want to ask you about the importance of cognitive neuroscience. So that's what you've been working with for a couple of years now, right, Joe?
Yeah, and neuroscience is a broad church that covers everything from, the way cells talk to each other at a chemical, physical level, all the way
Yeah,
up to the way people interact with each other. And my area is more on the human interaction. I'm interested in the brain basis for the way we behave, which of course has its roots all the way down in the chemistry, but that's not my area of expertise. I'm more interested in how brains affect behavior and how behavior affects our brains. And for me,
yeah,
that's cognitive neuroscience. That's the stuff that I'm interested in. It means that I get to work with other humans. So I work with people instead of any animals or cell lines or anything like that. And I have tools like brain scanners that allow me to do all of those kind of investigations safely. I mean, we're not damaging or doing anything invasive to a person. We have volunteers who go into a brain scanner or
yeah.
do an experiment. And I don't ask anybody to do experiments that I haven't done myself. So I've spent
Oh,
hundreds
yeah.
of hours in brain scanners.
So you
Um,
probably have a lot of scans of your brain, a lot of neuroimaging of your brain, yeah?
I have a stupid number of brain scans of my
Wow.
head. So
Yeah.
whenever I get a stroke, the doctors can be able to look and be like, "Oh, wasn't like this before."
Do you ever go back to your own scans looking for something like different patterns of as you age or something like that? Because I'd be really interested to do that if I had them, access
Well,
to my brain scans. Yeah.
that's exactly what I did. At some point when I realized I was I was doing it pretty regularly. I thought, oh, once a year, I'm going to get one on the same day every year so I can watch
Yeah.
my brain age. So I have a tiny little movie of my brain aging,
Oh,
which
wow.
at the moment is fairly subtle. I'm 55 at the moment,
Yeah.
and as far as I know, healthy. So
Yeah.
so I probably have maybe another decade or so before you start to see the aging more prominently in my brain, but I'm hoping to kind of keep it up just because it's fascinating and slightly scary.
Wow, that's amazing. And I also ask some of my guests here about learning because I really want teachers, educators to understand learning from a brain science perspective, but also from behavioral science and cognitive psychology and everything. So, how would you define learning, Joe, according to your field?
Right. For me, I equate learning and neuroplasticity, which
Yeah.
is not a useful way of thinking of it in terms of behavior, because there's so many different types of learning that change your brain, right? It could be learning new facts. It could be our conversation today is a new experience, and
Yeah.
that's learning, and that will physically change literally both of our brains. But even sort of what we would call like procedural learning. So I, for instance, I do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So I'm a sort of a
Wow.
lover of
Okay.
martial arts. But it's really hard to explain a lot of it. You know, a lot of it's kind of the muscle memory and just getting time and
Yeah.
practicing. All of that changes your brain too. I mean, even what we
Yeah.
refer to as muscle memory is actually memory in the motor system. So I think learning is just one of these incredibly broad terms, and
Yeah.
it applies to us every day, all day, which I think sometimes we don't appreciate. You know,
Yeah.
there's this idea somebody tells you something, you have to learn it, particularly
Yeah.
in like a classroom. But no, we're learning all the time. And it's a question of, you know, do we seek out those opportunities? What are we interested in? What are the things that sort of stick with you, and which are the ones that require more and more repetition? I'm really interested in martial arts. I just wish it didn't require quite so much repetition.
Wow, yeah. And Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I'm Brazilian, I'm based in Brazil. We have the Gracie family. They are, the kings of Jiu-Jitsu here in Brazil. They
They
have
are.
dojos everywhere, and that's amazing. I had no idea you were into Jiu-Jitsu.
Yeah.
That's
Well,
probably very good for your brain as well, unless you
well,
get hit in the head or something.
we don't normally do too many strikes, so I'm okay with that. And
Yeah.
also, yeah. And in fact, Hodger Gracie is the, you know, possibly the greatest ever to compete in the sport. And I train at Hodger Gracie's dojo here in London. So
Wow,
very
amazing.
fortunate to have him close to my home.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I remember you posted something on LinkedIn because I've been following your posts, very closely about the idea that we need to have very active social life. Exercise is very important for the brain. And then you mentioned something about the blue zones, where those things kind of come together in a very nice way. So can you tell us a little bit about that? What is really important from a brain perspective to keep us healthy?
Right. Yeah, I mean, this is something that's become more and more important to me as I get older, thinking about
Yeah.
healthy brain aging. And what's interesting is that a lot of the things that are just healthy are really important for keeping your brain so happy and healthy. So exercise, and it doesn't have
Yeah.
to be martial arts or going to the gym or, you know, swimming kilometers at a time. You know, as we get older, just staying regularly active, whether
Yeah.
that's gardening or walking or, you know, going to the cafe to meet with your friends, all of those things that promote cardiac health are really important for promoting brain health. And an
Yeah.
active social life is another one that's really important because we're a very social species. And if you become isolated, it really increases the risks of depression. And that actually speeds up sort of brain deterioration.
Yeah.
So just staying engaged is important with other people. And of course, keeping your brain active, you know, use it or lose it. Often I think people think, oh, well, that means I'll do Sudoku or crossword puzzles or something,
Yeah.
which are fun and you should do them if you like them. But they're not great at keeping your brain that active because if you're good at it, like you enjoy it, you're
Yeah.
probably not challenged by it. Whereas if you're doing something like trying to learn a new language or you've joined a social group that goes to museums or goes to music shows or does something that's sort of getting you culturally engaged in activities, even if it's just a walking club or a
Yeah.
gardening club. All of those things are perfect because people always push your, to your comprehension, your understanding. And that's the kind of, those are the three big ones for brain health. And
Yeah.
I sort of hope that everyone has the opportunity to do as much of that as possible for their own benefits. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, I remember watching that Netflix series about the blue zones, and I think there was an episode about Okinawa, and then you had a bunch of older people getting together, dancing, and telling stories and things like that. And nowadays, when we look around, people are always stuck on their phones and checking social media. Does that worry you, Joe? Especially now in the age of AI, like we're everything, even we're delegating our cognitive processes, to machines, right? So how do you feel about that?
I I have a mixed feeling about that. I
Yeah.
definitely am concerned about the sort of cognitive offloading.
Yeah.
That idea that we delegate to the machines. And of course, we've done this forever. Like cognitive offloading is not a new thing, even at a dumb level. Like I've had a calendar on my computer for years. I don't ever remember anybody's birthday. The calendar does,
True.
right?
Yeah.
But now with these advents of these LLMs and chatbots and things that can do more and more for us, it becomes easier to give them all the responsibility and not take it yourself. And you even see this with things like driving, right? So if you're driving in an area that you know, it's really useful to check your phone and see whether there's traffic so that you have to go a different way.
Yeah.
But if you know the area, you know the different routes, you could make that decision. You're probably going to make a better decision than some AI on your phone. However, loads of people have stopped, right? They look at their phone and it says take this route. And if you had asked them 2 years ago, they'd say, no, that's a stupid route. I'm actually going to go this other way.
Yeah.
And now they're just taking too much. And I worry about that for all of us, but I guess I really worry about that for the kids who
Yeah.
are growing up with it.
Yeah, I've been talking about Jonathan Haidt's book, the Anxious Generation, right? And he was in Brazil a couple of weeks ago, and it's very concerning to see that there has been kind of a rise in the number of depression, anxiety, even suicide, among teens, and that's very tragic and sad because it feels like we don't have any control over that, as educators, as parents, and do you feel that there should be something, I don't know, maybe a ban or something like that to control that, or do you have a more positive outcome for that?
Well, I have to say, I haven't followed the science incredibly well, but I know that some places have like banned smartphone use in primary schools up to a certain age. I think
Yeah.
Australia, for instance, has
Australia,
done.
yeah. Brazil has actually started doing that as well. Yeah.
Right. My impression is that's probably a good idea up to a certain point. I think
Yeah.
that, letting the kids be kids and socialize and play is more important than them developing the latest tech tools. They'll get that as they get a little bit older. And I think that, frankly, by secondary school, it's going to be impossible to ban that stuff anyway. So I think at that point, it becomes important for us to teach them how to use it productively to help them as opposed to sort of take their responsibility away from them.
That's true. Yeah, I agree. And I wanted to ask you about this, socializing, social interaction. This is really important for brain development as well.
Yes.
So can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I look at kids nowadays, and I feel like they're overprotected either way, whether they're with their phones on social media or not. I feel like everything has been designed to avoid, uh, getting them hurt or anything like that. But we kind of have to try out things and risk ourselves when we are a certain age so we can develop certain things, right?
Right. Yeah, it's hard if you're a parent or a teacher. Obviously you want to protect the little ones
Yeah.
and you don't want to see them get hurt. But by the same token, that's how we learn.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, exactly.
little kids do crazy things like climbing trees and things that they shouldn't and whatnot, and they fall off and it hurts and they learn. And in the really bad circumstances they break a bone or do something that's gonna slow them down for weeks or months. But the truth of the matter is we can't de-risk life, right? Life is full of risk.
Yeah.
And I think we've maybe the pendulum swung a little bit too far. I feel like we're trying to wrap the world in cotton wool so that nobody has to take responsibility. But the truth is, we also need to build resiliency skills. We need to
Yeah.
build problem solving. We need to deal with things that don't go right because they will at one point or another,
Yeah.
right? And
So
um,
true.
and if we don't do that, I don't think we're doing our kids any favor, you know?
Yeah. And
I see that at university. It's the same thing,
yeah.
right? Like we're trying to balance being as inclusive and helpful and supportive of our students as possible, which of course you want to do. That's really important. But also to make them responsible, to encourage them to develop resilience and understand that there are things that are hard and that you do have to work hard for. And if you don't, then there's some consequences to that. And
Yeah.
these consequences are safer now than they are, when maybe you're 20 years on and you're losing your job and not able to support your family. If you get a C on your exam in my class, that's not ideal, but in the scheme of things, you'll be fine.
You'll be fine, yeah. And you can get support from me as a teacher, you know. So it's better to do it here than right to wait
Right.
and then have to deal with worse consequences in the future, right? But I feel, Joe, that a lot of it comes from biased parents, right? I think, you know, when I was checking some statistics, and I think a lot of parents they feel that the world is more dangerous today because we are constantly, you know, watching TV news or looking on, you know, social media, and then it feels like a lot of bad stuff, a lot is going on, right? But maybe not necessarily. It's just our perception of things because now there's more visibility, let's say. So, can you tell us a little bit about that idea of bias? So, what is a cognitive bias, and how does that shape your perception?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And there are those kind of perceptual biases. That's sort of an availability bias because
Yeah,
now a lot of that information is more available to us, particularly if you like search it out,
yeah,
than it ever would have been, for instance, when I was a kid, when my parents were, struggling to raise me. Um, but in general, there's this idea that people are rational decision makers. I think we
yeah.
all like to think of ourselves as rational. Um, Particularly anytime you're talking to a friend or a loved one in an argument, right? You're like, I'm the rational one here.
True.
But the reality is we make a lot of decisions without going through the full process that you would need to be rational. A really classic example is every time you go to the grocery store, right?
Yeah,
If you went to the grocery store and sort of went through each and every product that you needed and did sort of a comparison about ingredients and prices and all the rest of it, you wouldn't leave the grocery store for hours. Whereas what you normally do is you go up and you grab the toothpaste that you normally get and you grab some fruit that looks good. And, you
yeah,
know, and the reality is that that's an efficient way to do things. It may not be a perfectly rational way to do things, but in terms of the cost benefits, it's very sensible.
true. Yeah,
And the thing about a lot of our biases is we've evolved these biases because they are sensible shortcuts that allow us to get onto other things. And sometimes they're sensible, like, I'm going to do what the rest of the group is doing because clearly, if we're all going through this traffic at this point, then there's probably a reason why that's okay,
yeah,
you know? And maybe that's not always right. There are times when the group does something that maybe you don't want to, but
yeah.
at the time it works out
More
fine.
often than not nowadays, I feel like we're following the group blindly, and then everybody's doing something wrong, right? But yeah, and have you seen? I wanted to ask you: have you seen that cognitive bias codex that I think it was on Wikipedia, right? I usually don't tell my students to check Wikipedia, not necessarily, but they did a very good job with the codex, and it's amazing. Like there are hundreds of biases, right?
It's an astonishing number, right? I mean,
Yeah,
people like Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky and Robert Thaler, excuse me, who have basically won Nobel Prizes for behavioral economics, spent their whole careers trying to investigate those and evidence them. And the problem is that it's quite a list, right?
yeah,
So when you look at one of those codexes, it becomes a real challenge to know, well, what if I want to do something to try to influence another person, let's just say in a positive way. So I'm gonna try to help people save more for their retirement, which I
Yeah,
think most people would agree is probably beneficial for the individual.
definitely. Yeah.
Um, then it becomes a tricky one because you look at that codex and you see, all right, I have 107 options, and I don't have any information about how they interact. All that the scientists have essentially done is list them and say, well, this is the X,
Yeah.
Y, Z. And the problem is that we don't have a lot of good data about how they work together, which means that a lot of well-intentioned interventions don't work or sometimes even backfire
Yeah.
because of sort of unintended consequences, which, is which makes it difficult to use biases in a productive way. You can, but it's not as easy as I just pull them off the shelf, find the one that looks right, and plug it
Yeah.
in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
On the other hand, a lot of people are trying to use those biases in a bad way, right? To influence consumer behavior. And I know you talk a lot about that. So there are ways you can get people to buy stuff that they don't need to impress people that don't care about them, just by using those biases, right, Joe?
Yeah, that's true. And it's interesting because people have referred to a lot of these biases as nudges, right? Ways of
Yeah.
influencing behavior. And Richard Thaler refers to using a nudge against someone as sludge. Is a term
Okay.
I like.
Yeah.
Um, but you see it a lot, particularly online. One of the common things that you'll see is if you go to a new website to try to get some new information, you have to sign up. You get the
Yeah.
first week for free or something, but you have to sign up, give them a credit card. And that's a classic use of sludge because the reality is, you've got that week free and you can then cancel, but you have to commit the effort to remembering that. This is otherwise what's
Yeah.
going to happen is you're going to get charged a week from now and
Yeah.
every month until you finally do remember, even though you may have never used it again at all. And that's a classic case of using our biases against us, which is, I'm pretty sure all of us will have encountered at this point.
Yeah, and I remember the scarcity trigger or whatever you call it, urgency trigger. So if you don't sign up today, then you won't be able to because this is the last day or something like that. And a lot of people sell courses like that, right? So
Sure.
yeah, and it does work, So they sell, right?
Sure. No, all
Yeah,
of these things really do work. I mean, I remember quite a few years ago, our TV had just broken, so I needed to buy a new TV, and I
yeah,
thought, oh, I'll get a decent sized TV, and I went into Costco's, which is a sort of a big store in
yeah.
the UK here, and they had this humongous TV, like I don't know, 80 or 90 inches, or I don't know,
Wow,
it was
yeah.
huge. And I think it was about 30,000 pounds or something. And I
Whoa.
just read it and
Yeah,
thought, that's just stupid. I mean, who buys that, right?
yeah.
But sort of next to it is this 3,000 pound TV that, all of a sudden looks great. And
Even though it's
I
still
had,
expensive, right?
right,
Yeah,
but I had no intention of spending 3,000 pounds, but all of a
yeah,
sudden it seemed like maybe it was a bit of a deal.
yeah.
And that's an anchoring bias. And despite the fact I teach it, I was definitely drawn in like, oh, maybe, no, no, that's, no.
Exactly. And can you tell us a little bit about confirmation bias? Because I feel like this is what's going on when people are spreading fake news, and when we give them evidence, arguments, they go like, "Yeah, but that doesn't align with what I know." And that's why I think people, they say, okay, do your own research. They go to YouTube, they watch one person, and they go like, okay, I know something that all those scientists have no idea because, so that's
Right.
confirmation bias, right?
Yeah, and this is a really pernicious one because it's
Yeah,
deep in our psyche. And I think it comes down to the idea that we have this idea of ourselves as rational and sensible and making good decisions.
yeah,
So we justify that. And one way to do that is confirmation bias. So the classic is that you seek out information that fits your predisposed ideas, right? I
yeah.
really want to buy a Porsche because I think they're cool looking cars and I've wanted one since I was a kid. And I can go out and find all these stats about why it's such a great car. Because I'm not looking at all the stats about the accidents that it gets in and
Yeah,
uh, that kind of thing is classic confirmation bias. Most people think, oh yeah, but that happens to other people, but that doesn't happen to me.
Oh,
Uh,
yes, true.
but it's really interesting because it was first described in the late 50s by this guy named Festinger, who was doing this really bizarre experiment where he had people, he wanted to look into confirmation bias. So he had people come in to his lab, and I think this was in Chicago in 1957, and they had this board with little wooden pegs in it. And his
Okay.
job that they were asked them to do was for an hour was to keep rotating the pegs 90 degrees. And he said this is to simulate the repetitive, boring factory work jobs that people have.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So it was a horrible job. Like, I mean, nobody liked it, right?
Yeah.
But half of the people, after they did this, were given $20, which is a lot of money in 1957,
Definitely. Yeah.
and half were given $1 by Festinger. And Festinger said, look, I'm in a bit of a rush. The next person's coming in. Could you tell them, because I have to go, would you
Yeah.
tell them that it's a fun experiment? Um, and
Okay.
um, what was fascinating was they were all basically willing to do it, which was a little surprised at. But he then debriefed them afterwards, and he said, "Well, the ones who had gotten $20 said, 'Yeah, you paid me really well. I'm happy to lie for you, man.'" Um,
Sure. Yeah.
but the ones who got $1, who had not been paid well, basically said, "Well, it was kind of a fun experiment. I did enjoy it." And he would ask them about it, and what had happened was getting $1 for an hour's worth of tedium was such a bad deal that they had changed in their mind how bad
Yeah.
the experiment was, right?
Oh, wow. Look at that.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. It's just a random selection of people. It wasn't, just some weird group or something. It's a common experience for all of us, and it's super easy to have it go against us.
Yeah, and that brings me to something that is really controversial, and people are talking about it even today. And I'm asking you this because I saw you posted something a while ago. It's NLP, neuro linguistic programming, and I feel like so the promises are kind of okay. So you can change the way you think about things. You can reframe the words you use to talk to describe situations, and then you can manifest a new reality. You can become a better version of yourself. It kind of sounds like magic in a way. And I know there are a lot of people making a lot of money from this. So what can you tell us about neurolinguistic programming, Joe?
It was originally developed in the sort of psychotherapy field to try to help people get over traumatic experiences. And as you said, it was about reframing, rethinking through events that were, problematic in their life, to try to come up to a different or better, less emotionally traumatic representation of them. And it was based on this rough idea of neuroplasticity and that words shape thought.
Okay.
Um, the
Yeah.
idea that word shaped thought is a pretty controversial um, perspective.
Yeah,
There's
that's
no
a
doubt
pure
that,
Worf, right? If I'm not
yeah, right,
mistaken. Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And the pure Worfian idea has been shown to be not true.
Yeah.
I think a lesser version of it is true in the sense that words do influence the way we think, and but we don't always need to think in words. There's more to the way we think than just the framing in words. Um, but it became a very popular idea, and it became important in coaching in particular, right?
Yeah.
So outside of the sort of clinic, people were using it to try to help people overcome, problems at work, problems in relationships, make them have better willpower, all very valuable, useful things to work
Yeah.
on. The problem is that the evidence behind neurolinguistic programming is minimal to none. And part of that is because there isn't any agreement on exactly what neurolinguistic programming is and is not. Different practitioners
Yeah.
do it differently. The first major investigation into the original NLP showed that there was no significant effects. But then the person who had created NLP said, "Yeah, but you were using NLP 1, and now I'm teaching NLP 2."
So it
Uh,
evolved. Okay.
yes.
Yeah.
And you had to come and train to get NLP 2 certified. So that same thing happened about 7 years later where they tested NLP 2. And again, there was no evidence in the effectiveness. But then the guy said, well, that's because I'm on to NLP 3. And you can see
Okay.
that we're in a non-useful sort of cycle here.
Sure.
There are an awful lot of people who use natural linguist or neurolinguistic programming in their coaching or otherwise professional life, and they claim that they have success. They have lots of stories of success. The problem is that it
Yeah.
hasn't been tested empirically in a rigorous fashion. So, of course, there are people who get better and they benefit from the fact that you are helping them, working with them, trying to work on these
Yeah.
problems. And that's brilliant. That's like really beneficial. My concern is just the idea that this tool has a scientific basis, and if it's being
Yeah.
sold to people on that basis, I'm not convinced that that's fair.
Yeah, and I've talked to some people who promote NLP, and they say something similar about neuroimaging studies, for example. They say, how do you know that those scans can tell us anything about how the brain actually learns and works? So you have I don't know, you have a computerized tomography, for example, or you have an EEG or something like that. How do you know that that translates into something that really exists in the world? So what can you tell us about that? How do you know neuroimaging studies, they give us
Right.
something to work on, actually something valuable? Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think that's a perfectly reasonable question. And with MRI, which is the technique that I use more than CT or EEG, but we can
Yeah.
talk about those if you want. The, I mean, I can walk you through this. I teach MRI and how it works, but
Yeah.
so look, we can talk about the physical basis of the way the signals are acquired, and then we can talk through the math of how we translate those signals into something like a visual image. And I can talk about the statistics that are used to determine whether or not there's an evidence base or not within that image. But then that possibly the question that they're really asking is, how do you know that like looking at that colored picture of a brain or a brain with spots on it tells you
Yeah.
something that's useful on a sort of personal level or something? And I think that that's a really important question because I'm not sure that it does, right?
Okay.
I mean, at some level, if you have a stroke and you get an image of your brain, it shows you where your stroke was. That is directly potentially relevant to you, your recovery, your family, the clinical care you'll get. So I don't think they're probably arguing about something like that. And that would
Yeah.
be true with a CT scan as well. Um, or if you have epilepsy, you can see the trace of epilepsy in the EEG, the electroencephalography.
Yeah.
Ooh, I didn't say that right. The EEG.
EEG, yeah, electroencephalography, right? Yeah.
Thank you. Yes,
That's it.
I'll stutter. So there are clinical benefits, but when you're sort of saying, well, how does knowing that, this part of the brain lights up affect me trying to overcome this problem? Then it becomes a little bit more difficult because there is a
Yeah.
big gap between what the evidence says and then how I'm going to apply that in a personal situation. And I'm sympathetic to that. I think that there are answers in specific cases, but there are many cases where the evidence doesn't tell you anything.
Yeah. And that's interesting because a lot of people will use neurojargon and images to promote things that are not really based on evidence. My professor, Paul Howard Jones, used to say that neuroscience is sexy. So
Yeah.
whenever you have some neuro something, it sells more. Is that the case? Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. There's a series of papers that have looked at what they called the seductive lore of neuroscience.
See, yeah.
Uh, and these were just, psychological studies where they gave people text that didn't really make that much sense. It was things like, well, learning math involves using your temporal lobes, and watching TV involves using your temporal lobes. So watching TV is going to help you learn math.
Okay, yeah.
Right. So it's a sort of a not a logical argument, but they included that text with like two pictures of the sort that you just described, like two
Yeah.
brain scans with lights on in the temporal lobes and things, versus like two bar plots showing math levels or something. And what they found was that by about 10%, people believed the material better when it had this sort of completely unnecessary brain pictures next to it.
Yeah.
And this has been replicated quite a few times, and they refer to it as SANE, the seductive allure of neuroscience explanations. Um, but it has the downside is that it can be misused, right? So
Yeah.
one of the examples that I have here is that there's a company that sells NeuroAgua. It is
Oh,
literally bottled water. Okay, but
okay.
it has neuro on it, and it's about 7 pounds a bottle.
Well, yeah,
And it says it's good for your brain, which is true. Water is good for your brain.
of course. Yeah. That's kind of obvious, right? Yeah.
Right. But other bottled waters don't cost 7 pounds a bottle.
Yeah.
They're playing on that sexiness of neuroscience. And in that case, I think that, to be honest, it's exploitative, in my
Yeah.
opinion.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's an ethical. They're capitalizing on the word neuro there, like that's what they're selling. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we're moving towards the end, Joe. I could spend hours here talking to you, but I really want to ask you about your work. What's exciting about, because you're working with cognitive neuroscience, but you're working more on behavior and interaction, right? People. What's exciting in this field nowadays? What are you trying to figure out?
Well, the thing that I'm very excited about at the moment is a colleague and I, Daniel Richardson, have been doing some work on trying to understand audience engagement. Like, how do you know an
Yeah.
audience really is into it? And in some ways, it kind of came from that, that feeling that all of us have when you go to a live show and you're like, yeah, but it's just got that energy. What is that?
Yeah. Yeah.
That was kind of the basic question. And maybe about 10, 12 years ago, there was a couple of papers that suggested that when we're together and engaged in some kind of group activity, we
Yeah.
actually get neural synchrony. Like literally your brain waves, my brain waves, Daniel's, they start to line up in some ways.
Okay.
And Daniel and I have been exploring that for the last 10, 15 years, trying to understand two things. One, where does that signal come from? Like, what are the things that cause this synchrony, and
Yeah.
what are the things that make it go up or down? Like, one of the crazy things to me is reaction videos. Because you've probably seen these, right, on
Oh
YouTube.
yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Maybe I'm too old to get this, but they're super popular.
They are. They are. Yeah. It's funny how I've watched a couple of those, especially when they're reacting to, TV series or a band they've never seen before, kids reacting to Guns N' Roses, for example. They're pretty popular. Yeah.
And one of the things that's remarkable is that little people in the corner watching the Guns N' Roses video
Yeah.
provides really minimal kind of social context. It's like, oh
Yeah.
yeah, we're together watching this. And what's astonishing is that we can measure neural synchrony to people watching the Guns N' Roses video
Yeah.
versus the reaction video to the Guns N' Roses video. And you can enhance like neural synchrony significantly. It's really easy to detect.
Wow. Yeah.
So things like that seem to be really fundamental to the way we interact in groups. And I think it has sort of interesting science questions, but also some interesting practical questions. Like if you're trying to make advertisements or TV shows or movies or trailers, you can test to see how well your audience is responding. And of
Yeah.
course, you can always ask them too, which is the traditional way. But you get some additional sort of brain-based evidence about how well people are responding and which parts of it, like not even just overall, but like second by second, which you would be hard pressed to ask them about.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's really, really interesting. Would you say that's also applicable when we think about teachers trying to engage their class, Because this is one of the biggest challenges nowadays. It feels like kids are kind of, they're addicted to cheap dopamine coming from their, phones. So how do you make sure that whatever you are doing as a teacher will engage them so they will pay attention and learn? So would that be applicable as well, that research?
Yeah, it is. And in fact, Daniel and I have done that sometimes in some of our classes. So we'll get, as many people in the audience to wear the wearable tech as possible. And then we'll just do a normal class or a segment of the class, whatever, and then look at how different parts of it. Because normally, if you just lecture at somebody, it's not that engaging,
Yeah.
right? You have different components, you have opportunities for them to do some discussing amongst themselves or problem solving, or, there's any number of things that a teacher is going to integrate into their class because nobody just yaks at them.
Yeah.
Um, you can then look at how those synchrony scores change over time and you see, well, which things were most effective and were they effective in the whole class or were there some subset that did better with them? So I need to have this so I get some of my students and this so I get others. And it's really remarkable. And it's super fun to sort of look at to sort of play with your teaching materials.
Okay.
And we enjoy that, but we're sort of geeky.
Yeah, so actually that brings me to the last section of this conversation. Let's geek out a little bit because I don't know about you, but I got into psychology and science because I was a major geek, growing up. I was like watching Star Wars, for example, major fan and comics. I was reading a lot of comics. Is that similar in your case? Did you like comics and sci-fi, fantasy, and things like that growing up? Yeah.
Yeah, I was a massive sci-fi fan. I still am. Sci-fi
Yeah.
fantasy. But in fact, I mean, when I started out my career, it was in AI,
Oh,
and it was
okay.
largely driven by sci-fi. So there were all these great like AIs in science fiction, right?
Yeah.
And I wanted to be able to talk to computers, but this was the mid 90s and wasn't even close. And I kind of got frustrated with the artificial side. And I thought, oh, I really need to learn something about how actual intelligence works so I can, maybe bring it back. And
Ah,
25 years on, I've been sidelined in sort of psychology, neuroscience. But all of a sudden, the AI's kind of come back and now talks to us, right? Like I
yeah.
missed my shot.
Exactly. Yeah. But so what kind of movies or books were you into growing up? Like I think Hall was, A Space Odyssey was one of the first for me. I mean, that movie was brilliant when I was growing up.
Right.
Having been produced at the time it was amazing, and I remember wanting to learn more about artificial intelligence as well as robots and things like that. Was it like that for you too?
For sure, yeah. And there was a book by Robert Heinlein called "The Moon is a Harsh Mistress,"
Oh
which is
yes.
yeah. So
Yeah.
it's set on the moon, and one of the main characters is an AI. His name is Mycroft or Mike, and
Yeah.
Mike was just the coolest character, and I wanted a Mike. Um,
Sure, yeah.
so that was influential. Isaac Asimov had a whole series of books on robotics and his idea of like how you would make sure robots could be safe for humans, right? And
Yeah.
what's astonishing is those rules very much still resonate, and all of the limitations of those rules still resonate as we not only have the robots, but now we have the sort of intelligent actors in terms of the AIs themselves. And it's funny to me that it's kind of come back around. We're 30,
Yeah.
40 years on.
Yeah. And do you ever think about the future of mankind, humanity because I feel like there's a Brazilian, to give you some context, there's a Brazilian neuroscientist, Miguel Nicolelis,
Okay.
who has just published a dystopian novel about, it's fun because he's doing a lot of work in neuro interface with machines and things like that. And now he's saying that in a couple of years everybody's going to be dumb because we're not using our critical thinking. Well, that's the novel, right? I'm not sure he believes that. But do you ever think what's going to happen to us in, let's say, I don't know, a century or so, if we keep interacting with AI and doing the cognitive offloading thing you said, delegating our critical thinking skills to machines? Have you ever thought about that?
Yeah, for sure. And I vacillate between being hopeful and being a little bit dystopian myself.
Yeah,
I certainly can foresee a future that people like Jeff Hinton and others have argued for, that the AIs basically move faster than us and think, yeah, you guys
yeah.
were cute for a while. Um,
Yeah,
but I'd like to think that we wouldn't be quite that dystopian, but it's that sort of neuromancer future where we start augmenting more and more. And obviously at the moment we augment through tech that we carry around with us or wear or whatnot. I don't think it's going to be that long before we think about implanting tech and we get a
yeah,
little bit Elon Musk-ish.
yeah,
I think that Neuralink is a little bit strange, but nonetheless, even if it's peripheral uh, enhancement, I think that we will move in that direction fairly quickly as the tools become sufficient for us to find it really useful.
yeah.
Extreme, right?
Well, it's crazy. It is. I'm not sure. I'm scared, or like you said, hopeful. Maybe something interesting will come out of this. But I feel like the biggest problem will always be teaching the new generations to deal with that. I think if, as a teacher, as an educator, I feel like if it's easy for them to do that, to offload their cognitive skills and not really build those synapses in their brain, then they're not getting any practice. They're not actually learning themselves. And then what's to prevent them from, let's say, plagiarizing an essay, or getting everything done through AI, and then that's not going to develop their brains, right?
Yeah, that's the truth. And I think that a lot of that falls on us in education. Like we have a lot of pressure on it now to be really
Yeah.
creative in a way that maybe we haven't been for a while, right? Like there's a traditional sort of side of education, and maybe that's no longer sufficient with the new tech inventions.
Yeah, that's so true. Well, Joe, as I said, I could spend hours here talking to you about, geeky stuff and neuroscience. Your final message, let us know where people can find your work. I know you're very active on LinkedIn. You have very, amazing posts. I really like what you post there. But is there any other place people can find what you do? You mentioned you're working on a book, or shall I
Right.
say, yeah? No
I'm
spoilers, right?
trying. I'm
You're
not
trying. Okay, good. I'm,
I'm
I'm
not the
looking
best
for.
at book agent
What can you
profiting me.
give us a little
Sure.
spoiler? Like, what is it about?
It's provisionally entitled Neurobolics, and
Okay, that's a great name.
it,
Yeah, great title.
it's about all the crazy myths and misinformation, which is which is fun, but I try to then roll it into, well, but what is true, and like why does it matter that we're getting some of these myths and misinformation wrong? Like, is it just something that's funny and we can laugh at, or does it have consequences, and who's
Yeah,
affected by this? And therefore, why does it help to actually know some of the genuine neuroscience? I'm trying to keep it light, because it's
yeah.
really easy to sort of come off as like, oh, you should know this. But the reality is, it changes so fast that I get things wrong too, and I work in that field. So, I
Yeah.
think you just have to laugh and say, okay, cool, let's try to make it fun.
After all, we are all biased, right? There's no way around it. So yeah, and things change very quickly. Well,
The truth. Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely.
Well, Joe, thank you so much. Looking forward to reading your book when it comes out. And folks, if you want to know more about Joe's work, make sure you follow him on LinkedIn. And I think that's it. That's where you're more active, right, Joe?
That's the only social that I'm on is LinkedIn.
That's smart, because I am everywhere, and I can feel the consequences now, getting addicted to social media and staying on my phone all the time. But well, thank you so much for accepting my invitation, Joe. It was a pleasure. And I think that's it for today, folks. Stay tuned for more Learning Cosmos podcast episodes.